There are empires that fall to stronger empires, and there are empires that fall to people they refuse to take seriously. The Vikings conquered from England to Constantinople. In Vinland, they met an enemy they could not see, could not catch, and could not understand. And that enemy was using weapons made of stone. In the year 1021, 150 Norse warriors stood on North American soil 500 years before Columbus was even born. They possessed iron weapons, chainmail armor, advanced sailing technology, and the combat experience of Europe's most feared raiders. Within 3 years, they would flee the continent forever, defeated by people they called Skraelings, a word that probably meant wretches or barbarians. The Vikings had conquered kingdoms from Ireland to Russia. They had served as the Byzantine emperor's personal guard. Their longships had terrorized coastlines from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Yet here, on the shores of what they called Vinland, they met something they had never encountered before, an enemy they could not defeat. How could 150 battle-hardened Norse warriors with iron weapons be driven from an entire continent by warriors using arrows tipped with stone? How could the first European contact with North America end so differently from all the others? The answer lies in a massacre, a misunderstood bull, an axe that may not have been stolen, and a style of warfare so effective that modern military thinkers still study its principles today. 500 years before Columbus, Vikings had already invaded North America. This forgotten war would determine whether European colonization began in 1000 CE or 1492. By the end of this video, you will understand why history's most feared warriors were driven from North America by warriors they initially dismissed as primitives. And you will understand why their failure may have been the most important military defeat in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The reason why will change everything you think you know about who was truly advanced and who was truly primitive. The year 1000 marked the height of Viking expansion. From their Scandinavian homeland, Norse raiders had become Norse settlers, establishing kingdoms across Europe. They had sailed rivers deep into Russia, discovered Iceland and Greenland, and pushed the boundaries of the known world further than any European civilization before them. Now they set their sights on lands even further west. Leading this new wave was the family of Eric the Red. First came Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000 discovered what he called Vinland, a land of wild grapes, endless timber, and rivers teeming with salmon. The medieval warm period had made the North Atlantic unusually navigable and the land unusually fertile. Vinland was not some frozen wasteland. It was paradise by Norse standards. Forests of towering trees perfect for shipbuilding, a resource desperately needed in deforested Greenland. Meadows for grazing, waters full of fish larger than any in European seas. Lanceau Meadows, discovered by archaeologists in 1960 and definitively dated to 1021 CE by a nature study in 2021, proves this was not myth. Here stood Europe's first confirmed foothold in the Americas, workshops for iron smelting, longhouses for dozens of settlers, boat repair facilities. This was not a temporary camp. This was meant to be permanent. The expedition of 1021 represented the culmination of 20 years of exploration. Leading them was Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant who had married Gudrid, widow of one of Leif Erikson's brothers. With him came Thorvald Eriksson himself, Leif's brother, burning with ambition. Among the 150 souls were warriors, certainly, but also women, children, and livestock. Cattle for milk, sheep for wool, pigs for everything else. This was not a raid. This was colonization. The power dynamics seemed clear. The Vikings brought iron broadaxes with meter-long hafts that could fell trees in minutes, pattern-welded swords with steel folded dozens of times, chainmail of thousands of interlocking iron rings that could turn aside any cutting weapon. They brought the military tactics that had conquered half of Europe. The indigenous peoples, likely Beothuk or Mi'kmaq nations, who had called these lands home for thousands of years, had arrows tipped with flint or bone, boats made of skin, armor made of hide. No horses, no metal weapons, no written military manuals. By every measure the Vikings understood, they were superior in every way. But here is what the Vikings did not understand. The indigenous people's weapons, dismissed as primitive, were perfectly adapted to their environment. Arrows could be crafted quickly from local materials. No need for supply lines stretching back across the Atlantic to Greenland. Their bows, made from flexible woods unknown in Europe, could drive those primitive arrows with surprising force at close range. Their skin boats could navigate waters too shallow for Viking longships, allowing them to strike from directions no Norse commander would think to guard. And the forest itself was their greatest weapon. Every tree, every stream, every ridge was known ground. For the Vikings it was wilderness, for the indigenous peoples it was home. And home advantage, as the Vikings were about to learn, is worth more than all the iron in Scandinavia. They were wrong. And the lesson would be written not in ink, but in Norse blood. The first contact between Vikings and indigenous peoples had actually been peaceful. The sagas record trade, red cloth exchanged for furs. The indigenous peoples were fascinated by the cloth's color, impossible to achieve with local dyes. The Vikings were impressed by the quality of the furs, superior to anything in European markets. Karlsefni, wise to the dangers of cultural misunderstanding, banned his people from trading weapons. For weeks, perhaps months, the two peoples existed side by side. Furs crossed one direction, cloth crossed the other. Neither side fully trusted the arrangement, but it held. It was the closest thing to peace that two completely alien cultures could manage. Then Thorvald Eriksson decided it did not need to hold. He led 9 men on an exploration up the coast. They found 9 indigenous men sleeping under their overturned skin boats on a quiet beach. What happened next was not combat. It was murder. Dawn mist clung to the beach as Thorvald's party discovered the overturned boats. 9 men lay sleeping beneath them, unaware that death stood over them with iron axes. Thorvald made the decision that would doom Norse America. Attack without warning, without provocation, without mercy. Viking axes, designed to split shields and chainmail, made quick work of unarmored men asleep on sand. The massacre took less than 2 minutes. 8 bodies lay still. Blood soaked into the beach. But the 9th man rolled away from a killing blow, scrambled to his feet, and vanished into the tree line before pursuing Vikings could catch him. No matter, Thorvald reportedly said, one savage cannot stand against Norse iron. That single survivor would cost them everything. The Vikings had sent a message. They just did not understand what message they had sent. Not, we are strong. The message was, we will kill you in your sleep. And the response to that message was already moving through the forest. 3 days passed in false calm. The Vikings returned to their base, boasting of their easy victory. On the 4th dawn, the indigenous response arrived. A scout ran into camp, gasping. The forests are moving! From the tree line emerged warriors. Dozens, then scores, then more than any Viking had ever seen assembled in this land. They moved in coordinated groups, spreading out to surround the Viking position with a discipline that would have impressed any European commander if a European commander had been willing to look. "Shield wall!" Thorvald bellowed. His men scrambled for weapons, forming their traditional defensive formation. Shields interlocked, swords drawn, axes ready. The formation that had broken Anglo-Saxon shield walls and scattered Frankish cavalry. But these enemies did not charge like European warriors. They stopped just outside sword range and unleashed their response. Arrows whistled through the morning air, not the scattered shots Vikings expected from primitives, but coordinated volleys. Stone and bone tips shattered against shields and mail. But the sheer volume was overwhelming. Vikings crouched behind their shields as arrows struck like hail. The indigenous warriors had answered the massacre not with blind rage but with tactical precision. They had shown the Vikings exactly how this war would be fought, on their terms. Thorvald ordered a fighting retreat to the longships, where the hulls could provide additional cover. His men backed toward the water, shields locked, as arrows continued to rain down. They made it to the ships and turned them sideways, creating a wooden wall. For hours, the arrow storm continued. Vikings huddled behind their fortifications, occasionally loosing arrows of their own. But their enemies were shadows in the forest, impossible to target. You could hear them moving through the undergrowth, you could hear the snap of bowstrings, but you could not see a single face to aim at. The forest itself seemed to be firing at them. Shield wall formations meant nothing when the enemy would not close to sword range. The entire Viking military doctrine, built on close combat where iron weapons dominated, was useless against an opponent who simply refused to engage on those terms. The geographic challenge was devastating. Unlike Europe, where you could force an enemy to fight by threatening their town or castle, here there was nothing to threaten. No cities to besiege, no roads to block, no king to capture. The enemy lived in the forest, fought from the forest, and disappeared into the forest. You cannot conquer what you cannot find. Then, during a brief lull, Thorvald peered between his shield and the ship's rail to assess the situation. A single arrow threaded the gap. The shaft, no thicker than a man's thumb, tipped with sharpened stone, found the few inches of exposed flesh between Thorvald's armor and his shield. It pierced deep into his armpit and punctured his lung. Stone should not have penetrated that deep. The angle should not have been possible. The timing, exactly when he exposed himself, suggested patient, skilled marksmanship beyond anything the Vikings had encountered in European warfare. You do not need to break the armor. You need to find the gap. And the person who fired that arrow had been waiting for the gap with a patience that no Norse warrior had ever faced. Thorvald looked at the shaft protruding from his body with genuine surprise. His last words would echo through the sagas. "I have gotten a good land in my grasp, though I shall hardly enjoy it." His men gathered around as their leader, brother of the famous Leif, son of Eric the Red, died on a nameless beach thousands of miles from home. They buried him at a place called Crossness, with wooden crosses at his head and feet as he had requested. The first Viking grave in North America. The first proof that iron armor could not guarantee victory. The indigenous warriors did not press their advantage. They melted back into the forest, their point made. This was not random violence. This was calculated response. They had shown they could kill Viking leaders. They had given the invaders a chance to leave. The Vikings did not take it. They saw Thorvald's death as demanding vengeance, not wisdom. They prepared for war against an enemy they still did not understand. An enemy that had just shown them exactly how this war would be fought and exactly how it would end. The pattern was now established. Vikings would try to impose European-style warfare, shield walls, armor, fixed positions. Indigenous warriors would respond with something the Vikings had never seen. Fluid tactics that used the forest itself as a weapon, mobility that made heavy armor a curse instead of a blessing, and a patience that turned every Viking charge into an exhausting chase with no enemy at the end of it. Every assumption the Norse carried across the Atlantic was about to be proven wrong, and this was only the beginning. Dawn broke over the settlement. The Vikings had survived winter, established their base, and begun to believe they could make this work despite Thorvald's death. Then chaos erupted from their own camp. The bull, a massive beast brought for breeding stock, broke free from its pen. Bellowing with rage or fear, it charged through the settlement and into the forest. Vikings scrambled after it, knowing they could not afford to lose such valuable livestock. A group of indigenous traders had approached the settlement for their regular exchange. They had never seen a domesticated bull. To them, this was a monster, a roaring demon with horns charging directly at them. Warriors scattered in terror. The bull, probably just seeking freedom, charged through their group and disappeared into the woods. But to the indigenous peoples, this looked like an attack, a Norse war beast set loose upon them. In the confusion, with Vikings chasing the bull and indigenous warriors defending against what they thought was an assault, violence erupted. 2 Vikings were cut down by arrows. How could a farm animal spark a war? Because neither side understood what the other was thinking. The Vikings saw a valuable animal escaping. The indigenous people saw a weapon they could not comprehend. Both sides saw the other's response as aggression, and neither side had the language, the cultural framework, or the trust left over from the massacre to stop and explain. The trading stopped, the fragile peace shattered, and both sides prepared for what came next. What came next revealed just how far the Vikings were willing to go. Months later, Karlsefni revealed the true nature of Viking intentions. He planned to capture indigenous people for European slave markets. The ambush was prepared carefully, but when they attacked a trading party, they found nothing but empty boats, decoys. The real warriors emerged from concealment on the heights above. The Vikings, caught in the open, faced a storm of arrows from above. One survivor later recalled more arrows than at Stamford Bridge, referencing the famous battle in England. But at Stamford Bridge, you could see your enemies and charge them. Here, enemies were shadows among trees, raining death from above. The Vikings fled to their ships under constant fire. The kidnapping plot died on that beach, along with any Viking illusion of easy conquest. By the second winter, both sides were exhausted. Trade tentatively resumed at a new settlement called Hop further south, where the climate was milder. Vikings needed furs for the cold. Indigenous peoples had developed a taste for milk products. The peace was fragile but holding. Then came the final provocation. At a new trading settlement called Hop, a Viking accused an indigenous trader of stealing his axe. No investigation, no attempt to search, no consideration that the axe might simply be misplaced. The accused man was seized and killed on the spot, executed for a crime that was never proven. This was the pattern that had repeated since the massacre on the beach. Viking justice applied to people who had no voice in it. Viking rules imposed on people who had never agreed to them. And every time it happened, the consequences grew worse. The massacre cost them Thorvald. The bull incident cost them trade. The kidnapping attempt cost them credibility. The axe murder would cost them Vinland. 3 days later, the horizon filled with boats. Not a handful of trading vessels, a flotilla. Skin boats beyond counting approaching from multiple directions. They had tolerated unprovoked massacre. They had endured the bull incident. They had defended against enslavement. But the execution of an innocent man under the guise of justice demanded a response that would end the Viking experiment in North America forever. What followed was not a battle. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The indigenous warriors unveiled not a new weapon, but a new way of fighting. They did not mass for assault against Viking shields. They maintained distance, using coordinated arrow fire to pin defenders, while other groups moved to flanking positions. Every Viking strength was systematically negated. Close combat where iron weapons dominated, never engage at sword range. Fixed battles where discipline mattered, fight fluid engagements where terrain knowledge trumped formation. Armor advantage, make them pursue until that armor became a fatal burden. Psychological warfare through berserker charges, counter with ghost warriors who struck and vanished. Fire arrows at night, aimed not at Vikings, but at their psychological stability. Random attacks, denying sleep, wearing down morale night after night. Supply raids targeting Viking food stores, forcing them to forage in hostile territory where every tree could hide an ambush. Feigned retreats, drawing armored Vikings into exhausting pursuits, then ambushing the scattered survivors. The sagas record a telling incident. A group of Vikings pursuing raiders who had struck their cattle chased them into the forest. The indigenous warriors maintained just enough distance to stay visible, but always out of reach. For hours, the chase continued deeper into unfamiliar ground. Finally, exhausted Vikings in heavy chainmail collapsed. The warriors they had been chasing turned back and killed them at leisure with stones and clubs. Iron armor useless against blunt trauma when the man wearing it cannot lift his arms. That single incident tells you everything about why the Vikings lost. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that understood attrition better than any European power. An enemy that did not need to win battles. They only needed to make battles too expensive to fight. And iron, which seemed like an advantage, was actually the heaviest disadvantage of all. 20 kilograms of chainmail is protection in a sword fight. It is a death sentence in a foot chase through dense forest against men who are wearing nothing but leather and carrying weapons that weigh almost nothing. The indigenous tactical innovation was simple but revolutionary. Deny the enemy their strengths. Make iron irrelevant. Make armor a burden. Make the forest your ally and their graveyard. Every military manual in Europe was useless in Vinland, because the people who lived there had written their own manual, and the textbook was the land itself. 0 major Viking victories were recorded in 3 years of conflict. Think about what that means. The same warriors who conquered kingdoms from Ireland to Russia, who had sacked Paris and besieged Constantinople, who had carved empires from the frozen rivers of Russia to the sun-baked coasts of Sicily, could not win a single decisive engagement against warriors using stone weapons. Not one. In 3 years. The problem was not courage. The Vikings had more courage than any force in Europe. The problem was that courage without adaptation is just a more dramatic way to die. But this was not just military defeat. It was psychological catastrophe. Vikings defined themselves through victory, through conquest, through imposing their will on others. Here, every strength became weakness. Every tactic failed. Every assumption proved wrong. The settlement became a prison. Women could not gather food without armed escort. Children could not play outside the walls. The cattle that had not been killed were slowly starving because grazing meant vulnerability. The dream of Vinland turned into a nightmare of constant vigilance, sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that they were losing a war they did not know how to fight. Every sortie cost them men they could not replace. Every day brought new tactics they could not counter. Their iron weapons meant nothing if they could not bring them to bear. And the enemy had figured out, with devastating clarity, exactly how to ensure they never could. The Vikings, who had terrorized the coastlines of Europe, were now the ones being terrorized. The irony was complete. The raiders had become the raided, and they had no answer for it. Year 3 arrived with the settlement barely functioning. Karlsefni held a council. They had 2 options: abandon Vinland or die in it. Some warriors, clinging to honor, argued for fighting to the death. But the women, including Karlsefni's wife Gudrid, who had given birth to a son named Snorri during the expedition, provided the voice of reason. What honor was there in letting children die for pride? The final Norse council in North America was bitter. They had come as conquerors and were leaving as refugees. They had planned to establish a kingdom and were fleeing with whatever they could carry. They had dreamed of saga-worthy victories and found only defeat. The warriors who argued for fighting to the death were overruled not by a commander, but by the women who had crossed an ocean carrying children and were not willing to watch those children die for a word like honor. There is something in that moment that deserves attention. The decision to abandon Vinland was not made by generals studying maps. It was made by mothers holding infants in a room that smelled of smoke and fear, and the certain knowledge that tomorrow would bring more arrows from the tree line. The retreat was chaos wrapped in desperation. Vikings loaded their ships with frantic energy, abandoning anything that could not fit. 3 years of construction, cultivation, and dreams left behind in hours. The buildings at Lanceau Meadows, workshops that had smelted iron, longhouses that had sheltered families, all abandoned to the elements and to the people who had driven them out. Indigenous warriors maintained pressure until the end. Arrows whistled from the tree line as Vikings carried supplies to their ships. No massive final assault. That was not their way. Just constant reminder that leaving was the only option that did not end in death. Gudrid clutched Snorri, the first European born in the Americas, as their ship pushed off. Around her, wounded men groaned from arrow wounds that festered without proper treatment. The sight of North America fading behind them brought not sadness but relief. They had come as conquerors and were leaving as refugees. The same people who had made Europe tremble were themselves fleeing in fear. History's most feared raiders had found something to fear. An enemy that would not fight by their rules, could not be intimidated by their reputation, and knew exactly how to turn every Viking strength into a weakness. When they reached Greenland, then Iceland, the stories spread quickly. The official sagas would emphasize Norse bravery and minimize the defeat. But the truth traveled in whispers. Vinland was death. The Skrælings were unbeatable. Stay away. Snorri Thorfinnsson, that first European American, grew up in Iceland hearing stories of his birthplace. He never returned. No one did. His unique status, born in a land his people could not conquer, symbolized the entire failed venture. The journey home took weeks of North Atlantic sailing. Ships that had left Greenland, filled with hope, returned carrying defeat. Karlsefni, the merchant who had invested everything in this venture, spent the voyage calculating losses, not just in goods but in reputation. The warriors who had fled rather than died faced social stigma that would follow them for the rest of their lives. When the stories reached Iceland, the official sagas emphasized Norse bravery and minimized the defeat. But the truth traveled in whispers. Vinland was death. The Skrælings were unbeatable. Stay away. No one challenged those whispers, because the men who could have were either dead in Vinland or too ashamed to speak. No major expedition returned to Vinland. The western route was closed, declared unprofitable and unsurvivable. And here is where the story becomes something larger than a failed settlement. The Viking defeat in Vinland created a 500-year pause in European expansion westward, history's most consequential delay. Consider the alternative. Vikings establish a permanent settlement. European diseases arrive half a millennium early. Indigenous peoples face apocalyptic plague when their populations number in the thousands, not the millions. European colonization begins in 1000 CE, not 1492. The peoples of North America would have been erased before they ever had the chance to build what they built. Instead, indigenous victory created a barrier that held for centuries. Europe forgot about Western lands. Maps labeled them as mythology. And in those 500 years, something extraordinary happened on the other side of the Atlantic. The Aztec Empire rose to its height. The Inca controlled thousands of miles of territory. The Mississippian culture built cities that rivaled European capitals. Continental civilizations with millions of inhabitants developed, grew, flourished. Those civilizations existed because the Vikings failed. When Columbus finally crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he found not scattered tribes, but a hemisphere of peoples numbering in the tens of millions. The diseases that Europeans brought were devastating, catastrophically so, but they struck populations large enough that survival, however diminished, was possible. In 1021, those same diseases would have found populations too small to absorb the blow. The indigenous peoples who defeated the Vikings at Vinland did not know they were saving a hemisphere. They were defending their homes. They were protecting their families. They were doing what any people would do when strangers with iron weapons murdered their kinsmen in their sleep. But the consequence of their victory echoed across 5 centuries and 2 continents. Indigenous oral traditions, where they survived the later epidemics, told stories of this victory. Stories of warriors who used intelligence and knowledge to defeat brute force. Stories of successful defense against invaders from across the sea. These stories sustained resistance mindsets through later and darker chapters of history. They were proof that European invaders could be beaten, that iron was not destiny, that the land itself could be a weapon if you knew how to use it. The Viking failure at Vinland may have been the single most important military defeat in the history of the Western Hemisphere, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it preserved. 500 years of human development, 500 years of cities being built and languages being spoken, and children being born into civilizations that would not have existed if 150 Norse warriors had managed to hold a patch of coastline in 1021. Modern military thinkers study asymmetric warfare in Afghanistan, Vietnam, and other conflicts where technological superiority failed against determined local resistance. The principles are not new. Indigenous North Americans wrote the textbook 1,000 years ago. Mobility over armor, knowledge over strength, patience over aggression. Sometimes the most advanced technology is knowing every stream and hill. Sometimes the greatest weapon is making your enemy fight on your terms. Sometimes victory comes not from having iron, but from making iron irrelevant. Modern archaeology confirms what the sagas hinted at. Europeans really did try to colonize North America 500 years before Columbus, and they really did fail. That failure established patterns that would replay throughout history. European technological superiority assumed, but not guaranteed. Indigenous tactical innovation underestimated at European peril. Terrain advantage trumping weapons advantage. The myth of inevitable European dominance dies in Vinland. If Vikings, Europe's apex predators, the warriors who made emperors pay tribute and kings build walls, could be defeated by stone weapons and superior tactics, then technological determinism fails. History is not about superior civilizations replacing inferior ones. It is about adaptation, tactics, and will. And on the shores of Vinland, 1,000 years ago, the people with the least technology demonstrated the most will. And will, as the Vikings learned at the cost of everything they had carried across the ocean, is the one advantage that iron cannot buy. Go back to that first image. 150 Vikings with iron weapons standing on North American soil. Behind them, the most advanced sailing technology in the world. Ahead of them, a continent they believed they would conquer. They lasted 3 years. The continent is still there. The Vikings are not. The Vikings measured strength in iron. The people of Vinland measured it in something else, in knowing every stream and every hill, in patience that outlasted armor, in the understanding that you do not need to break a sword if you can make the hand that holds it too exhausted to swing. When iron met stone on North American shores, stone won. And for 500 years, Europe remembered that lesson and stayed away.